Okay, so here we have the discussion between Rumford, who was in the air. Well, he might actually have been flying. It's more likely that he was commanding from the ground, as most Air Force high command did, because it's too dangerous for them to fly. And so, but he is the Air Force historian, and Billy, who would have been a scout, is a scout on the ground, right? Except he's not a scout anymore; he's a prisoner of war in Dresden. So Rumsford's position is essentially high in many different ways. He's the historian, so he's telling the history of the Air Force. He's high in rank, and he's high literally as as a man in the Air Force, looking down essentially at the people on the ground. It had to be done, Rumford told Billy, speaking of the destruction of Dresden. I know, said Billy. That's war. I know. I'm not complaining. It must have been hell on the ground. It was, said Billy Pilgrim. Pity the men who had to do it. I do, on 198. So Billy is not angry about the destruction, right? Because remember that he's strapped to this flat car and he's going down the railroad tracks of his life, and all he can do is accept it. So he's not angry about it. He's just like, this is just how it is. There's a this is what drives a lot of people nuts, is this sort of fatalism. However, Vonnegut and Vonnegut's narrator, Vonnegut, who was writing the book, his story, the book of Billy's story, has a very different point of view. He's pissed. He's not so phlegmatic at all about the disasters around that have happened basically to him, because after all, he also, like Billy Pilgrim, was in Dresden and on the ground. And he connects the Dresden firestorm with a string of other kinds of violence. And really what he's doing is he's drawing a line from the Dresden firestorm to Vietnam, because Vietnam has been raging and is now at a very bad point. It's crossed actually over it's crossed over the worst possible point, the Tet Offensive in 1968. And so on page 210, shortly after Rumsford and Pilgrim have the discussion, Rumford and Pilgrim have the discussion, he says, Vonnegut, or his narrator, says, Robert Kennedy, whose summer home is 8 miles from the home I live in all year round, was shot 2 nights ago. He died that night, so it goes. Martin Luther King was shot a month ago. He died too, so it goes. And every day my government gives me a count of corpses created by military science in Vietnam. So it goes. My father died many years ago of natural causes. So it goes. He was a sweet man. He was a gun nut, too. He left me his guns. They rest on 210. Now, Vonnegut uses this phrase, so it goes, after every time after somebody dies. Whether it's a mass number or one, this is how it is, basically. And the people, it can operate to just drive you nuts, or it can become a sort of litany of it's sort of as if you're dealing with a character and then they turn into a gravestone. And that's sort of, I think, what's going on here. I mean, I think that this is a linguistic gravestone for the character or the person, and then the narrative carries on. And remember that the people he's looking at, say Robert Kennedy, who was John Kennedy's brother and considered to be his true successor. He was an attorney general for John. And Kennedy was the peace candidate. He was running against Nixon, and it looked very much like he was going to win. I mean, and there was a fear on the right that the Kennedys were going to have. They were worried the Kennedys were going to have a legacy, or they were going to have essentially an imperial presidency, where there would be, John would have been president, and then Robert, and then Teddy. And of course, after Chappaquiddick, where Teddy Kennedy and Mary Jo Kopechne were in a car together, and the car went off a bridge into the water, and he ran, and she drowned. That was the end of. I mean, there was no way that he was going to be able to go across the country and campaign as president, and get over this, essentially the fact that he had run. But Robert really was a danger to it really looked as though in '68 Robert was going to be successful. So his killing was considered to be part of the kneecapping or beheading, really, of the left wing or the moderate Democrats, really, because although Robert appeared to be a peace candidate, it wasn't actually clear that he was going to stop the Vietnam War, but that's what it looked like. Okay, so the killing of Robert Kennedy and the death of Martin Luther King together, King, who had been the architect of the most successful campaign against basically white supremacy, white supremacists, and racist politics, and perhaps the most successful civil leader that there was in the '60s, because he was not appointed. He was chosen by the people. I mean, King was a natural, charismatic leader. Anyway, so the death of these two men really was incredibly important. And it doesn't. Vonnegut's point about this is it doesn't matter, basically, whether or not they're well connected, or because they were both, well connected. Well, okay, Martin Luther King was connected to his community, and what happened in the assassination of King was that it tended to push the African American community, some of the African American community, towards radicalization. Not all of it at all. Still, the African American community persisted in doing what it took up King's work. Largely, his widow, Coretta Scott King, took up that work and began to carry it on. But the reason that King was killed was probably because he began speaking out against Vietnam, and he began to say, because they'd sort of begun, he could see that they were winning in America. The African American population had forced integration. They'd forced desegregation, even in the South. They'd begun to win a series of court battles that ensured that they were going to have access to basic human rights, basically. And it was obviously this is not over. This is the heartbreaking part of this, of what we've seen this summer, is that we have to have this bloody thing again. It's like, oh yeah, we have to have it basically we sort of seem to have it every 20 years until the job is done, right? But King began to say, why are we fighting in Vietnam? Because Vietnam is an extension of essentially white supremacist ideals in Vietnam against another brown people or people of color. Okay.